Thank you very much, Karina. I'm Tom Mitchell. I head the Climate Change Programme at the Overseas Development Institute, and I have the really great honour of introducing this very esteemed panel. And it's an opportunity, I think, for us to get a little bit deeper about what zero poverty and zero emissions really means. We spent some time over the last few months at the Overseas Development Institute thinking quite hard about this issue. And the more you scratch below the surface, the more complicated it gets, that we found. And there's lots of different pathways to think about. There's interacting scenarios, there's differences in time, there's differences in action in different parts of the world, there's the opportunity for exploring zero-zero within a particular country context, and it goes on. But I'm so glad that we've got five world-leading experts in this area to help us navigate through some of this and to set us up for the discussions over the next 2 days that will allow us to really interrogate this and see what it is that we can do together to set ourselves on the trajectory towards zero-zero. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk for a short period and then really turn it over to questions and discussion. This is a discussion session, so begin to think about your perspectives and ready to offer those when we've heard the initial thoughts of the panelists. But first, let me turn to my colleague at ODI, Ilmi Granoff, a lawyer by training, heads our green growth team at ODI, and Ilmi and his team have spent the last few months putting together the conference discussion paper that you will have seen on your way in and that you may have to hand. And Ilmi's going to start by helping us think through the basic questions that we're posing in this panel. Why a focus on zero extreme poverty and zero net emissions? Why does it matter? And how will we get there? Ilmi, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Please don't hold it against me that I'm a lawyer by training, but I did try to dig through what the main issues are in this with a really great team who I want to thank. It's quite challenging when you're dealing with these different siloed disciplines of poverty and development economics, climate change scenarios, climate crisis scenarios, as Yolanda would have us put it, quite sensibly. And so my team did a really admirable job of trying to really tease out the debate. I'll focus on the teaser trailer version headline points that I think we unearthed in our process, but I'll note that at 1:15 during the lunch here, I'll do a PowerPoint presentation and really invite you all to participate. We purposely published this as a discussion paper to invite engagement because it's such a complex topic, to really create ownership and interest and to have your feedback on it. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I'll go through a more detailed version then. I think some of the headline points, we started by looking at what it takes to get to zero extreme poverty, since that is arguably the minimum ethical floor of development. And we can all agree that that's where our moral obligation lies, to eradicate extreme poverty, while there are other very important public policy goals. And the projections that we looked at are surprisingly aligned, that show that we can eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, but largely depend on very high and perhaps overly optimistic growth rates. And also don't acknowledge the great diversity of country circumstances that affect the ability of growth, economic growth, to reduce extreme poverty. And when we dug into this question a bit further, we realized, much the same way that the World Bank's revised priorities over the last 2 years have become, is that realistically to achieve the eradication of extreme poverty in the next 15 years or so, we do need growth. We need moderate and sustained growth. We probably won't have the high growth rates that those earlier projections show, but what we need also is a significant change in the inequality of growth and the benefits of growth across income groups, particularly among the extreme poor. We then turn to looking at the climate crisis, and we note that basically to keep within a 2-degree boundary of climate change, a 2 degrees Celsius global mean temperature change, we need to set ourselves on a zero net emissions trajectory by the latter half of this century. We focused on the more conservative estimate to give ourselves a little room of reaching zero net emissions by 2100. That still means a very radical change to our business as usual growth trajectory, where some countries will have already needed to have peaked their emissions by now, the big emitters. But all countries will essentially have to have peaked their greenhouse gas emissions by the decade following 2030, which happens to be also the window that we're aiming to eradicate extreme poverty. That means that action now affects our ability, in all contexts, affects our ability to meet our zero net emissions trajectory. Now, there is an obvious angle to this that is important to emphasize first and foremost, which is it means that big emitter countries who have extreme poverty eradication either in their own country or in other countries as a policy priority for domestic development or international development, it would be policy incoherent for them not to prioritize radical reductions in emissions and really bending the curve of their emissions and still try to prioritize extreme poverty eradication. Why is that? Because, again, to eradicate extreme the 2-degree barrier is necessary to stay within this 2-degree barrier. We did a little number crunching, and it looks like on the order of about half a billion people will be vulnerable to the effects of climate change and be vulnerable such that they will either be drawn back into extreme poverty or be trapped in extreme poverty by virtue of climate change. So the two goals become very, very aligned. We then dug into the possibility of addressing these two, and I'll very briefly just note the potential for negative cost or cost-saving measures in the developing world context where there is a large amount of extreme poverty is very high. We also noted there are some challenges around the growth trajectory that you need to both eradicate extreme poverty and reduce emissions significantly, or bend the curve towards lower emissions. But actually, the moderate sustained growth necessary for poverty eradication and extreme poverty eradication is quite compatible with a low carbon development pathway. And so if we really focus on where our moral obligation is to eradicate extreme poverty, these two are quite compatible. We also have to focus on inequality to eradicate extreme poverty. And the final note in that regard, which we can get into deeper at lunch, is basically that reducing the inequality of growth and reducing our emissions trajectory both require significant transformation of business as usual growth. They both require transformation. So it is not a question of choosing between business as usual growth in order to eradicate poverty or low carbon development, but actually to meet either of these, we need to focus on delivering development that reduces the inequality of growth in a way that is low carbon. And there are many opportunities in that space for synergy. There are places where there are challenges, but there's a lot more synergy in that transformation than focusing on a BAU pathway, a business as usual pathway, in order to reduce poverty and then worrying about emissions later.
Ilmi, thank you very much. Really good thoughts to start the session. Let me pass on to Professor Chris Field. Chris is the co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC and founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology and professor of interdisciplinary environmental studies at Stanford University. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's really exciting to see this group convening around a really defining issue. I want to introduce 4 themes of the recent IPCC reports that really provide a foundation for the topics that will be discussed here and really open up a variety of compelling opportunities for looking at pathways forward. These concern the concept of zero emissions and the way it fits into the possibilities for the future, the concept of eras of climate change and the difference between the next few decades and the latter decades of the century. And third is the concept of co-benefits and how that's really empowering for the agenda. And the fourth is the relevance of development pathway. And let me start with this concept of zero emissions. You know, until recently, the climate challenge was often conceptualized as realigning energy sources, sort of fiddling around the edges of the energy system, thinking about transitions from coal to natural gas, increasing the fraction of renewables in the energy system. But if you look at the latest reports from the IPCC, the overwhelming conclusion is that emissions need to go to zero, almost independent of what the temperature target is. It's not that zero emissions is ambitious, it's required no matter what we do. In some ways, if you step back and think about that, that's incredibly empowering for innovation moving forward. What we're looking at is a series of private sector opportunities, public sector opportunities that involve a genuine rethinking of the energy system all the way from the top to the bottom. Let me speak for just a second about the idea of eras of climate change. You know, the movement that we're all a part of, I think, started out with the idea that ambitious action early on could moderate the need for lots of adaptation. But we're now in an era where it's clear that consequences of climate changes that have already occurred are widespread, and it's also clear that independent of the level of ambition and mitigation going forward, we're not going to see a big difference between a business as usual pathway and an ambitious mitigation pathway over the next few decades. The climate changes and the climate change impacts we'll experience in the next few decades are essentially baked into the system, and we need to be aware that during these next few decades, investments in adaptation are going to be the vehicle through which the impacts are addressed. But this era, you can think about it as an era of climate responsibility, is also the time when investments in mitigation are going to be determinant about what the trajectory is through the second half of the century. So we really need to confront the dual challenge right now of investing in adaptation to address the climate changes that are already baked into the system, and mitigation to address the opportunity to really reach a low carbon pathway and a low climate change pathway during the second half of the century. A lot of that is empowered by the concept of co-benefits, which really comes out very strongly across the whole set of IPCC reports. I think that the conceptualization of the problem, especially before the AR5, was that we're really looking fundamentally at trade-offs between adaptation, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and mitigation. But what you see when you look at them in a comprehensive package is that there are a wide variety of co-benefits, and taking advantage of those co-benefits fundamentally empowering. I think that's should be the real goal of the discussion here, is to figure out how to capitalize on co-benefits so that the sustainable development agenda, the zero poverty agenda, is aligned with the agenda for disaster risk reduction, zero emissions, and sustainable development. And then finally, let me just speak to the importance of development pathway. It's really clear that changing the energy system has got to be the foundation of what happens going forward. But that's much more difficult in a context where we also aren't re-envisioning what it means to have livable cities, sustainable water systems, sustainable food systems. And if we think about a development pathway that is emphasizing the sustainability of each of the components of the human and the global enterprise, we're really making the climate problem a lot easier and a lot more understandable, a lot more solvable. So one of the things that's most compelling, most attractive about the agenda of this dialogue, and supported by the IPCC reports, is the recognition that attention to development pathway actually makes the problem solvable. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Chris, thank you very so much. Thank you, Chris. Let me move straight on. I realize we're running a little bit behind time, but apologies to kind of rush through. Thank you for the panel, particularly already for brevity. Let's go next to Farhana Yamin. Farhana, somebody who's had a huge influence over my career. I first joined IDS when Farhana was there, and I think learned an awful lot from Farhana and her experience in working in the international negotiations since back in before '92, I think. And Farhana is still supporting the Association of Small Island States, is the founder and CEO of Track Zero, an associate fellow of Chatham House, a visiting professor. I could go on and on, really. Farhana has a lot of affiliations, but Farhana, over to you.
Well, thank thank you very much. Is this on?
Just hold on 1 second.
I think so. Yeah.
It's on?
It's on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's a relief and a joy to be here, away from the negotiations for a short while. But at the same time, I have to say that the themes that you're discussing here are very resonant there too. So in my comments and remarks, I'm going to emphasize that you're doing the intellectual, practical, connecting part of what some of the parties in those sets of negotiations as we speak today are trying to insert into a new agreement which will define our collective climate action, the development pathways, and whether or not we are able to meet these twin goals of zero poverty, zero emissions. I'm going to be a little bit provocative and start off with my end point, which is if I was to have my way, I would say it's zero emissions, zero poverty, zero tolerance for corruption and vested interests. And I think that's the third zero that's missing, and it needs to be on there. And I would change the timeline, which could be 50 years, 70 years, I'm not sure what within a generation means, but I would just get rid of it and say starting today, because that's what we must do. I think one of the things in my own career that I'm reflecting on is why on earth, for the last 20 years, did I accept that halving poverty was the right global goal for the MDGs? Why did we accept that half the world's poor should remain poor? So I'm increasingly becoming intolerant. I think in many other areas of social and public policy, it's been proven that a zero tolerance approach delivers the transformation, delivers innovation of the kind that Chris spoke of, and actually changes our mindsets and allows us to really rethink the system. I've also become very intolerant of certain vocabularies. So I refuse to talk about bending the curve. There is no curve. It's a very steep trajectory downwards. And we have to face the fact that, you know, if we were on a mountain, we would have to just accept there is no other pathway except to roller coaster and throw ourselves down and hopefully arrive safely. I think we will arrive safely. So I think we need to start rethinking our vocabularies. We need to start becoming bolder. We need to start accepting that actually today is a day when the efforts, for example, from the grandfather of Climate and Development Day, we should act like we've won. And that's why I wanted to show you the slides that I had, a couple of slides. So I'll just go on to the clicker. If you go on to slide 19, I'll do that. So there's lots of stuff here, which I'll just come back to. But I wanted to show you this one slide and where we are. Yeah. So all of these, from Lima to Paris, there's a very big group of actors, communities, cities, companies, thought leaders who are already on, they're already incorporating the zero emissions, zero poverty agenda into what they're doing and looking at different scales of how to get there. So I've named some of the cities here, but this is multiplying by the day. Every time I recreate this graph, I have to kind of, and I'm not very good at it, stick another graphic in. So this one is slightly out of date and more and more things are popping up. The agenda of zero emissions, zero poverty is also being embraced by campaigns and NGOs and businesses everywhere. So I've put up some of the ministers from some of the countries who have supported this, some of the businesses who are already incorporating this into their own narrative and increasingly into their own business practices. There are energy companies who accept the goal of net zero, and they've done that on the 2100 timeframe. We can talk, and I will talk a little bit about why the timeframe is very important. And this is a graph that I wanted to show you very quickly. So actually, in one way or another, all the countries of the UNFCCC already support zero because 2 degrees requires 0. Countries that are the most vulnerable, AOSIS, LDCs and others, around 150 countries plus, support 1.5 degrees, which in essence requires you to phase out earlier by around mid-century for all gases and slightly earlier for CO2 gases. There are countries, and I'm going to go just quickly onto those, and you may not be able to read these from where you are, but many countries have started the transition to this positive, cleaner, greener, sustainable energy for all transition in quite a major way. And we don't really celebrate or understand or how to support that fact. And many of them are developing countries, have very strong targets, what we call plus 50% of replacement of their electricity with clean resources. So actually we're pretty close. So there are countries which are listed here which are quieter or silent and have not yet joined the negotiations framework in terms of advocating this as a goal. And many of them are actually the countries that are dependent on the export and use of fossil fuels. So let me just come to that directly. The challenge for our generation is simply that one, to decide to turn away from a global development model and a mindset that accepts that our energy will come from under the earth, basically, that we have to dig it up or drill it out. And actually, this may have been true 10, 15 years ago, but it's no longer the case now. We do not simply need to rely on fossil fuel-based energy when we have integrative design which can reduce the consumption of energy needed from buildings and the urban environment to 20% if done right at those design stages. And that's pretty much for free and low cost. If you design cities and buildings in the right way, you don't need all the energy that we used to need. And this is a hugely important and neglected kind of discussion. And I hope very much that it's one that's emphasized in the course of the day. How do we design urban environments? How do we design cities? How do we make sure that we don't simply replicate the kind of development model which has failed in the developed and developing countries the world over? So I think one of the biggest challenges is accepting that we don't have to do the same thing that we've been doing, and that the Paris Agreement, in my view, would be successful, not necessarily for what it contains in the commitments chapter, which is important, but if all around the world we accept the inevitability and the desirability of a non-fossil fuel-based future the world over, including a future which supports decentralized community energy solutions for everyone. I think if we did that, we would be able to have a much stronger collective joint agenda that we speak to. And I hope very much that as we work forward in the SDGs process and in the climate change process and every other process, we become bolder and frankly more intolerant to excuses that were put in our way. So my last sort of comment was really a question. You know, why have we not solved global poverty for 60 years? And I think it is because we have accepted incremental reduction percentage point-based solutions when actually we needed to have much more holistic, systemic, and frankly political discussions that we supported. And we need, as researchers and activists, to rise to that challenge and make that an acceptable part of our discourse, of our language, and to say actually solutions that trade off the human rights of 2/3 of the planet, solutions that condemn 100 countries to a survival mode indefinitely or lead to their extinction as cultures is not acceptable. It is not a trade-off, it's not acceptable. And the way I think you do that is by using the vocabulary and the mindset of zero. So I hope that you can carry on with your wonderful research and take that radical boldness further. Thank you.
Farhana, thank you so much. We'll pass on now. It's a difficult act to follow, I'm sure. We'll pass on to Dr. Youba Sokona. Works at the South Centre as a special advisor on sustainable development, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, member of the Future Earth Science Committee, and until 2012 was coordinator of the African Climate Policy Centre in Ethiopia at UNECA. Dr. Sokona, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And as we are here in a public forum, and then the father of the Development Day said that this is not at all about the negotiation, is on open space. And then to come in on a number of issues we have to deal with. There is one fundamental relationship between the two elements. Poverty and emissions are related to development, maldevelopment, inequitable development, and sustainable development. Because both are generating poverty, increasing poverty, deepen poverty, and increasing emissions. And then development is a fundamental entry point how to deal with the issue. Now, the first question is that, can we do it? Can we have 0-0 in a generation? For sure. This is the model can tell us. Model is what? Is a salsa. And then if you put too much salt in salsa, you can pour some sugar to make the equilibrium. Model tell us. But let us face the reality. Unfortunately, the reality is different. Facing the reality, that means understanding poverty, because it's not about figures. Poverty cannot be represented by $1.2 or $2. It's complicated, it's complex, but it appears simple. But in essence, it means not being able to function effectively in a society, not being able to see a doctor when you are ill, not being able to have food when you are starving, not being able to go to school, to read. Leave your child dying because of you cannot see a doctor. And those are some fundamental elements. You cannot present that by a figure. And it's much more complicated. And it's fundamentally related to the energy issue. Because not having decent water, sanitation, and then being able to feed the productive sector, you need energy. For sure. Just to give you some indication, the 20 million inhabitants of New York City are consuming more energy than the 1 billion, almost billion Africans. I'm not advocating here that to have the similar level of energy consumption of the citizens of Manhattan and the African. This is not possible. It's not doable because of the 9 billion people in the world cannot have the same energy consumption level. But it's important, it's fundamental that the citizens of Manhattan accept to reduce their energy consumption for the citizen of Wataguna or Segu, my hometown, to increase their energy consumption. And this is a fundamental issue we have to deal with. And it's the reality, we can elaborate on that. And I think there is a number of routes we have to take because the objective of 0-0 is to translate the hope, the aspiration to the reality. Let us move away from the models and then facing the reality. That means looking at development trajectory, development perspectives. And in that sense, and I think there is some critical fundamental issue that has been raised by Yolanda when she made sure her keynote speak. We have to focus continuous basis on information, education, and awareness raising. And then each of the time I'm traveling in different countries, I was in Buenos Aires 2 days ago and this morning here, and the taxi driver told me, what are you doing? I said, I'm working on climate. He said, what climate? And then I tried to explain to them. And it's important that our daily life, we have to change our behavior. And this is a fundamental step. The model cannot tell us that. And this is one critical element. And then the second element that is crucial, that is fundamental, it's important, and then for us in the, to look at in those different perspectives, and then to get that our development aspiration right. And this is crucial, this is fundamental. And I think that in a continuous basis, if we are not educating people, we are not informing people, we are not raising awareness, and then we just get attached or attracted to the issue when something happens. When a catastrophe happens, we look at, oh, we have to deal with it, and then we forget. Climate issue and poverty issue are, just to end up my talk, it's like the difference between blood pressure and headache. If you have a headache, you take a pill, you are done. But the blood pressure means it has to be on a continuous basis for life. You know, my first blood pressure, I go to the doctor, and then he gave me medication. And then the next time I said, okay, can I take it? He said, no, for life. You cannot. And this is exactly what we are doing. Climate and poverty is like blood pressure, and then we have to take it continuously to take care. Let me stop from here. Thank you.
Youba, sincere thanks. Pass on now to Jane Ebinger, manager of the Climate Policy and Finance team at the World Bank. Jane, over to you.
Hello? Thank you. When we think about the challenges of eradicating extreme poverty and of tackling climate change, we see a vast array of very complex but also very connected issues. And we also see not just many fast-moving challenges, but many fast-moving opportunities. And as we think today about where do we go, it's important to start our conversation from what have we seen, where have we come from. Globally, we've seen the poverty rate fall in half since 1990, but progress in the developing world has been very uneven, and extreme poverty remains widespread in most low-income countries. We've talked about numbers. Worldwide, close to 1 billion people live in poverty, but it's not really telling the full story when we just talk about $1.25 a day. And it's also important to note that 800 million remain undernourished. On top of that, we face many challenges because half of the low-income countries are classified as fragile and conflict-affected. That affects many of the ways that we can intervene and provide support. And many middle-income countries also have challenges. They have substantial levels of extreme poverty, and many people who have escaped poverty remain poor and vulnerable. So that's just the poverty story. And what's been happening on climate change? We've been seeing dramatic climate changes and weather extremes. They've been affecting millions of people, damaging crops, affecting coastlines, and putting water security at risk. And we know going forward that even with very ambitious mitigation action, warming close to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by mid-century is already locked into the Earth's system, and that all of these extreme heat events we've been talking about may be unavoidable. That's going to require us to think differently about development. We're going to have to think differently about development because it's going to have potentially severe impacts on crop yields. We're going to see water resources shift. We're going to see communicable diseases change and move into new geographical areas, and we're going to see sea levels rise. But how does it translate into impacts for the poorest? Many of the impacts that we talk about when we talk about climate change are affecting them the most. They live on the front line, they live in areas that are most vulnerable, and they have the least resources to be able to adapt to these challenges. Extreme weather and droughts can put food and water supplies at risk for them. They can raise prices for basic services like food and energy. It can destroy assets, homes and businesses, They're often built on the edges of livable land. And many of the poorer and most vulnerable have little resilience to the volatility or the economic havoc that climate change can bring. More shocks can just put those that have come out of poverty back under the poverty line and threaten to reverse decades of progress that we have made towards eradicating poverty. So we know we can't continue on a path of unchecked and growing emissions. The recent IPCC report makes that clear and lays out a pathway towards decarbonating our economy by 2100. But they also emphasize that the next 20 years are going to be very critical in that process. So when we look at this from the perspective of the World Bank Group, where development budgets and institutions and the investments that we make, the support and advice we provide to our clients, all of that now is going to have to be shaped in a world of rapidly changing climate. At the top of our agenda, we need to protect the poor, but we also need to protect the planet. So we're working on ways at the World Bank on how we can bring together and address both poverty and climate change at the same time. We're looking at how policies for mitigating and adapting to climate change can be designed to protect the poor. We need to focus going forward on those policy changes that will help stimulate a shift in investment to clean public transport, to livable cities, to more energy efficiency in the factories, in the buildings that we use, and the appliances that we all have at home. And therefore, by doing so, we can achieve growth and we can deliver climate benefits. But it's not enough just to support that. We need to pair climate-related policies with social policies that can reduce poverty, modernize those economies that were carbon intensive. And there are examples around the world where action has been taken in this space. If we look at British Columbia, they've shown us how revenue from a carbon tax can provide targeted support for the poor while reducing business and income taxes. A low-income climate action tax credit provides quarterly payments to the poor to offset higher prices. And as a result of this, British Columbia today has one of the lowest income taxes in the country, a thriving economy fueled in part by green growth, and its emissions have also fallen. There are also opportunities to look at this from the perspective of fossil fuel subsidy reduction. If we can reduce those subsidies and use the savings to create targeted support for the poor who need assistance when fuel prices rise. So we need to build new sources for the poor. We can look at things like energy credits. We can look at reduced transit fares or cash transfers while we phase out those subsidies. And we have good examples around the world of where this has started to take place. In Indonesia in 2005, they deployed a program of unconditional cash transfers, which provided a third of the population with $30 a quarter, significantly above the increased energy price rise. But when we think about mitigation policies, we really need to think about the flip side to this discussion, how to build resilience and help the poorest countries deal with effects of climate change. We can do this through better land use planning, improved infrastructure to reduce their vulnerability. And we're working with countries like St. Lucia, hit in 2010 by Hurricane Thomas. St. Lucia lost 43% of GDP. And we're working with them today to help provide better data sharing, to build back better and reduce future losses as they're hit from increasing intense events. So eliminating poverty and keeping climate at bay as we deal with climate change requires a wider use of those things that we already know work well. We need well-funded social protection programs that can easily be scaled up after a disaster. We need the data and the capacity to identify the transient poor and provide them with targeted support. We need to ensure financial inclusion so the poor can save and borrow and they can bounce back quickly from shocks. And we need to provide the access to healthcare and education, the important underpinnings of a resilient economy. But we mustn't forget, as we think about this picture, that there are also opportunities. The actions that we're talking about are the same that make development work and accommodate a growing population. They're the same that can provide job opportunities, greater access to work, healthcare and education, and the same opportunities that can build resilience. They're the ones that can build new incomes as we look at opportunities like payment for ecosystem services or policies that encourage green industries. I'll conclude with a reference to the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. It makes it very clear that we must tackle climate change now, that the next 2 decades are critically important, and that failing to do that will increase the costs and the risks for all of us. Thank you.
Jane, thank you very much. I'm sure you'll agree that we've heard some really rich, wonderful perspectives on the issue this morning, on the intolerance of the sustained extreme poverty, on the fact that zero emissions is not a choice, it's there in every scenario, in every number you pick, we have to get to zero emissions. And that the poorest are already being struck by climate change in a way that reduces their ability to escape poverty, and the list goes on and on. But it's for you now to raise points, to pull out your perspectives, to have a discussion. This is not about asking the panel questions, it's about raising your perspectives, letting your voice be heard. If, when you indicate you want to speak, you could state your name and where you're from, and then really try hard to be short and sharp and pithy and provocative if you want to be, and then it will allow us to have a discussion over the next 15 or 20 minutes. Camilla, let's start with you.
Great. My name's Camilla Tallman. I've got the pleasure of being Director of IID for another few months. The job applications have to be in by Monday of next week, so go onto our website, do think of applying. We need a stonkingly good director to follow my act. Farhana, I'd really be keen to hear how we get zero tolerance to vested interests and corruption really embedded in all of our political systems where, frankly, at the moment it's rife. Is it by getting onto the streets? You know, if there are 3 things we need to go out and do now in order to get that zero tolerance put into practice, what would they be?
Thank you, Camilla. Let's see other hands. Yeah, gentleman there. Sorry, we're just switching mics here. Give us 1 second. Yes,
Thanks.
sir.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Arreran. I'm a journalist, an anthropologist, and
could you speak up just a little bit, please? We're struggling to hear.
My name is Gabriel Arreran. I'm a journalist, an anthropologist, and I have a question for a World Bank lady. I would like to know which is the World Bank policy regarding the funding of oil exploration, and especially their policies or whether they are thinking about fracking.
Okay, thank you. Simon Anderson.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Simon from IID. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ilmi, particularly for mentioning radical emissions reductions. We're going to have a session on radical adaptation this afternoon, where we're going to echo some of the words from the World Bank representative, looking at the way that we can get social development instruments to work together to really get people out of vulnerability and out of poverty. Can I just say that on your list, Farhana, of countries, El País Vasco, where I was, the Basque country, where I was earlier this week, they had a Klimagune, which is Basque for climate workshop. And the Minister for Natural Environment and Climate in the Basque Country announced there will be new legislation and a new adaptation program for the Basque Country. So please add that to your list.
Thank you, Simon. In the back, and then, sorry to make you run around, right in the back of the room next.
Hello, my name is Jorge Brito, and I'm a student here in Lima from Newton College. It's actually an open question because I just want to get to know a little bit more about it. We've mentioned about renewable resources and how we're planning to accomplish the zero emission by these ideas, but have we actually thought about what are we going to do with countries such as UAE that one of their main income comes from fossil fuels?
Okay, thank you. Let's keep going. 3 questions down here in a cluster. Okay.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Achala Basinger. I'm also from IID, and I'm sorry for so many IIDs coming in. But my main affiliation here is with the LDC group. I'm the legal advisor to the chair of the least developed countries in the climate change negotiations. And this is a group of 48 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, but also one of the most vocal in the climate change negotiations. And one of the key positions that they are calling for in the negotiations that is related to this concept here today is the call for 1.5-degree target. That's their long-term emissions target that they are calling for. But my question to Farhana, perhaps, in the negotiations, when we publicly call for this 1.5-degree target, but this group, many other people in the negotiations, when we call for zero emissions, they get scared with that word. How do we get to that development target of the least developed countries with zero emissions? Is that the right wording? Maybe we have to call for climate neutrality. I just want to make sure that we have the right wording to approach and make sure that these countries are on board with this concept and not scare them off with the concept. Thank you very much.
Achala, thank you. And then another gentleman down here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sebastian Rosado. I'm from the same school as Jorge Brito, and I'd like to follow up the first question with the following question. How do you plan to reconcile zero tolerance for emissions with the interests of big corporations who currently show no interest in adopting these kinds of policies?
Okay,
such as Nike.
Very good, thank you. Then a gentleman just behind there as well.
Good morning, I'm Arif Rahman from Lead Pakistan. We've heard 2 or 3 different ways in which we've tried to describe poverty. We've heard of extremely poor people, and we've heard of generally people who are poor. So we've come down to metrics, $2 a day, $1.50 a day. But we're not really talking about poor people themselves. We're talking about poverty-stricken and extremely poor people. But what about inequalities in general? So how does this actually link to taking care of inequalities where a lot of people might be poor all over the world, but might not be under poverty levels?
Okay, good point, thank you. Gentleman right in the back corner as well has been jumping up and down with his hand up. We'll keep going for a few more, and then I'll ask the panel to pick some hot topics for them to respond to.
I'll be provocative, just because you said you made the request to be provocative. The question's to Jane. I'm surprised and intrigued that you gave the example of the carbon tax and its functionality in BC. The bank has backed, as you know, for decades and counting carbon markets and hasn't touched taxes with a 10-foot pole. So can you talk about that? Have we just heard from you now some sea changes in bank policy? Would love to hear more about that. Michael Dorsey, Director of Sierra Club. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Right next to him there, yeah.
Good morning, I'm Delphine Ganapin. I'm the Global Manager of the UNDP-GEF Small Grants Program. One of the lessons we've learned from providing grants, and a lot of them are very successful, is eventually one has to deal with power. And you can only scale up if you empower the grassroots that have succeeded in their zero emissions or in their sustainable development work. And so when I looked at zero poverty and zero emissions within a generation, it's really quite ambitious. And it requires really radical shifts in power. So I wonder if we can discuss these shifts in power. And you know, when we talk a lot about poverty and we look at economic poverty, but perhaps we should start discussing power poverty. You know, people not having power, and that's why all of these bad things are happening. You know? But then how do we shift power? And it's going to be very difficult because those in power right now will not agree and will not allow the shifts in power.
Okay, thank you. Let's take two more. Where's the hands? One right in the back and one right in the front. Let's go for that.
Good morning, Roberto Brito from American Red Cross. There are a lot of things that all organizations have been doing to help this climate change or change the climate crisis. And I think in a forum like this, it will be important to mention what we have done as organizations, because maybe we focus a lot in the things we should change or may change, but also there are good things that all organizations have been doing, and we are working very hard as NGOs and even governments. So I will really appreciate if you can say a few bullet points about the good things that we are working, that we have worked, and should continue doing.
Okay, thank you. And then a lady right in the back there before we come right to the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Saida. My name is Saida from Sudan. I see zero poverty, zero emission. This is a very significant equation. But what about the area of non-poverty? Is the emission is just from area of poverty? Thank you.
Okay, and then the final point before we go back to the panel, right in the front, Neil.
Neil Leary from Dickinson College in the United States. The discussion of this dual challenge of zero emissions, zero poverty, there was mention of investments being needed in adaptation and in mitigation. In many, and certainly in the society I come from, and many of yours, I think there are discussions of where it's very myopic, very short-sighted of seeing that it's problematic making investments in areas where we want to be investing in lots of public infrastructure. We need more private investment. Where are the leverage points in these conversations? What language can we use to get away from this idea that we need to be fiscally responsible in a very short-sighted way and start really getting people to accept the challenges and understand that if we don't make these investments now, we're going to be headed in really wrong directions. And I think the question about the issue of power and power politics is very much tied up into this as to where is this investment going to be directed in these ways? How do we get fingers into these conversations to move them in good ways? Okay, thank you, Neil. Back to the panel. It's a bit of a job to sift through that, but I saw some trends there. Trends, I think, about really challenging us to think what's it going to take to shift the mindsets of those who don't want to change, or you know, what's it going to take to convince those that bottom line depends on fossil fuels that there's a new future, there's a different future. A set of questions, I think, about injustices, a set of questions about how do we really make it known that there is a zero tolerance of this. Questions then about investment trajectories. But let me offer you the opportunity to make one or two remarks, but as short as possible and no more than a minute possibly, so we can stay somewhat on trajectory today. Let's go in reverse order, shall we? Jane, there was quite a few directed at you as well. I don't know how many you want to pick up. Yeah.
So one of the questions was about what's our energy policy, As many of you know, the World Bank Group is supporting the Sustainable Energy for All goals. So that's universal access, doubling renewable energy and doubling the rate of energy efficiency. But how we translate that into development and how we translate that into the World Bank Group's business is laid out in an energy directions paper that was endorsed by the bank's board in July 2013. So that can be accessed on our website. It has the core principles that you would see in SE for All, affordable, reliable and sustainable energy. It focuses on expanding access to modern energy services, scaling up renewables and energy efficiency, looking at least cost energy options, but it also provides finance and advice to countries on oil and gas extraction, production, processing, transmission and distribution. And so our approach on those issues is laid out in that energy directions paper. The second question that was asked was about policies for carbon pricing. So for those of you who've been watching the UN Climate Summit in September, the Secretary General Summit, at that summit, 74 governments and subnational entities and 1,000 businesses came together to indicate their support for a long-term price on carbon. And what they talked about was that how you put a price on carbon should be up to those countries, should be tailored to the national circumstances or the circumstances of that business. And so, that could be through market-based instruments, it could be through taxation or a combination of both. And within the business environment, it can be through integrating the social cost of carbon in decision-making. At the World Bank Group, we're continuing to engage with those corporations and those countries. And we launched a carbon pricing leadership coalition at our annual meeting in October. And that will focus on how to support countries and share experience on the action side, to help provide just-in-time knowledge on topics people are concerned about if they're considering this, and also to continue the dialogue around this topic.
Jane, can I stop you there and hand on? Thank you very much. Youba next. You're mic'd up already, aren't you?
I think that we have a life experience of what needs to be done and how. Ebola. Because in my own country it has been stopped for focusing on 3 critical issues: education, information, and training. Because it could spread. It has started in West Africa because of the development system, because of the poverty, because people use social relations because they cannot go to the hospital, and then to secure the people who they will not reject people who get Ebola, and then it starts spreading, and it has been stopped by that. In the climate issues, we need to focus on awareness raising, information and education on a permanent basis. If we do that, we can deal with the issue. It is not a matter of, it's a matter of reducing, a matter of behaving completely differently. Changing behavior will take generations. It will not happen in overnight. And then let us focus on information, education, awareness raising, and then to have a public opinion. Because it's a matter of each individual in this planet. And then we need to have a public opinion. The politician, then the other people, the decision maker, will never act unless they have a public pressure. And then the public pressure will only happen if they are informed, if they are educated, if they are aware.
Thank you, Youba. Farhana, to you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to speak about the issues of power and the power conversation that we've probably neglected and need to now focus on. So Camilla, I was trying to be succinct. What are the 3 things that I would focus on? Well, internationally, who sits at the table and whose voice is missing? So when I go into a room as a lawyer, that's one of the big things, as a rule of thumb, you figure out who's in the room, who's not in the room, who's got a say. And if you look at the analysis actually of all of the officers that have been elected as officials of the parties, they've been elected on the basis of equitable geographical representation and then this Annex 1, non-Annex 1 sort of balancing act. And we've always tried to get the SIDS constituency and the LDCs a share of that, a share of the space at the table. But I did an analysis which was published about 2 years ago of looking at those seats in terms of fossil fuel dependent countries, which is not mandated by the rules of the UN. And you find that there's actually, they have consistently over 20 years had around a third more seats than you would expect with an equitable geographical balance basis. So some of that is just partly because they're richer and have resources, and some of it is not that. Some of it is a very persistent pattern and an acceptance that their interests should have a dominant voice in the process. So that's one thing I think we should be more careful about. A couple of years ago, we had the decision in Doha where we looked at the gender balance and gender equality issues and had a decision on that. And parties are now encouraged to apply a gender lens to the seats and the choice of officers that they elect. And we should, I think, in my view, apply the power fossil fuel lens in this process and in every other process related to that. I think there are also some very good examples from other campaigns and industries. For example, the tobacco control, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control has a legal provision, an article that essentially controls vested interests, and they're not allowed to lobby, and then has guidelines that sit underneath that. And that international convention came as a result of many jurisdictions recognizing the disproportionate and frankly deceitful influence of the tobacco industry in the regulation of health. So the health industry has taken action to regulate a vested interest, the pharmaceuticals in that case, the tobacco industry in that case. There are many, many precedents, and we have not done the same thing. I think the glimmer of hope is actually groups like Avaz and 350 who are not orientated and speak to the development industry, it is an industry, are better placed and are starting to make these connections and are able to have and catalyze that power conversation better and their counterparts in other countries.
Farhana, we're going to have to move on very quickly now.
Just the final thing on the position of UEA and countries that have actual or potential, for example, fossil fuel reserves. I think the zero is an important message and metric. I think the metric of 2 degrees doesn't make any sense, but if you say your financial portfolio, your tax base has to be 0 carbon, that makes a very big message and a very big way of reanalyzing where they need to go. And many countries are now beginning, and many investors are now beginning to decarbonize their financial portfolios. So that's a very important, positive way forward.
Thank you, Farhana. Chris.
Thanks, Tom. Let me just say a couple of words about what it means to have zero emissions, and also the question of whether reductions goal in terms of percentages,
climate goal in terms of temperature, or zero emissions is going to make the most sense for different stakeholders. Let me reiterate that if the climate goal is 1.5, we need zero emissions.
If it's 2, we need zero emissions.
If it's 2.5, we need zero emissions. If it's 3, we need zero emissions. If it's higher than 3, we still need zero emissions at some point in the century. Now, you could view that as confusing and challenging, but you can also view it as empowering. What it means is there's an opportunity for early adopters who are willing to push the technologies, who are willing to take advantage of investment opportunities to really dominate the energy system as a consequence of developing compelling solutions for low carbon environments. The fact that no matter what your target is, requires zero emissions eventually, needs to be understood as opening a door. And my personal feeling is that it's not necessarily the case that an emissions goal in terms of a percentage reduction or a temperature or a zero emissions is intrinsically better. I would guess that as the conversations unfold, there are going to be different stakeholders who see the value in each of those. But they're all interconnected, and it's the interconnections that in many ways create the opportunities. And let me just say that I think those are opportunities that actually relate to the big energy companies as well as to civil society and groups around the world, because the big energy companies actually know a lot about how to bring in projects at scale, how to develop innovative concepts to the level where they can really be deployed globally. And once they understand that zero emissions is in their future as well, I wouldn't be surprised. I would expect to see investments throughout the economy and throughout the world to really bring these things to fruition. And there are opportunities for all the players.
Chris, thank you very much. And the final word to Ilmi.
I actually want to reiterate this point about power, because I think I don't have a crisp answer, but I do think that the points that were made about the international regime and inequality of power really can also be made at a domestic level and at the country level. And maybe that's the entry point for asking this question about vested interests, which is to say, ultimately, this is about whether we believe the role of the state is to address inequality or to reinforce vested interests. And we won't be able to address this issue. It becomes harder and harder to address both the poverty issue and the low carbon development issue if we don't hold states accountable to this issue of inequality. And I think that is actually, if anything, has emerged from our discussion paper that was somewhat newer before we started, which is to sort of see the ability to address inequality makes it more feasible to reduce extreme poverty to zero or near zero by 2030 and to reduce emissions on that scale. And essentially the sort of more trickle-down model to eradication of poverty doesn't work in a low-carbon world, and it makes it very difficult to address that. So we really have to be changing the way we're targeting extreme poverty.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your patience in us running a little bit late, but I'm sure you'll agree that there was a really valuable discussion and lots of perspectives that have really set us up well for the remainder of today and tomorrow. So if you'll join me in thanking you as respondents and the panel, and we'll break for coffee.